Let me please introduce you the presenter in our third session. Our presenter is Ms. Chara Chioni-Chotouman. She has a PhD from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Her paper is titled as Country Report of Greece. Before we start, I'd like to kindly remind you that you have 30 minutes for your talk. Then we'll move on to the questions and answers. As a reminder for our dear participants, your questions for the Q&A discussion can be placed into the chat box. Please, honorable presenter, you may start your presentation now. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and discussing this very interesting topic. So I shared my screen. I believe that everyone can see it. So today and now we're going to talk about the Istanbul Convention and Greece and how it affected especially criminal law. So Greece signed the convention in May 2011. However, it was ratified in 2018 with Law 4531 of 2018. This law brought significant amendments both in the Penal Code and in Law 3500 of 2006 on domestic abuse. This is a special statute on domestic abuse. However, violence against women is not included per se in Greece in criminal legislation, and it's not accepted as discrimination based on gender. So there is not a specific discrimination based on gender. However, we have it for religion, for ethnicity, and so on. Here in Greece, when we talk about domestic abuse, we have the specific legislation on domestic abuse and articles in the Penal Code, especially Article 312 on inflicting physical injuries to powerless people, and 333 on threat, both applicable between spouses during the marriage or cohabiting partners. So if we have spouses during the marriage, not when they are divorced and so on, or cohabiting partners, we use the articles in the Penal Code. When to all the other incidents that we're going to see, we use a special statute. Before we review the legislation, I would like to make a small review of the reservations that Greece made in relation to the Istanbul Convention. The reservations are possible to be made according to Article 78 of the Convention. So we did, and it referred to the jurisdiction. So for Greece, there is no jurisdiction when the offense is committed by a person who has her or his habitual residence in Greece. So when the act is committed outside Greece, Greece has no jurisdiction for people that have their habitual residence. However, if you are a Greek national, there is jurisdiction, even if the act is committed outside Greece. Moreover, Greece's jurisdiction for incidents committed outside Greece is bound to the condition that sexual violence, including rape, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, forced abortion, and sterilization, are criminalized in the territory where they were committed. Moreover, Greece's jurisdiction for Greek nationals, of course, is subordinate to the condition that prosecution for the aforementioned crimes, which are extremely serious, can only be initiated following a reporting by the victim. So we've seen here that Greece made some reservations regarding jurisdiction for Greek nationals and acts committed outside Greece. So let's see which were the significant amendments that the Istanbul Convention brought to Greek legislation. First of all, I would like to review the special statute on domestic abuse. By ratifying the Istanbul Convention, the notion of family, according to the special statute, was expanded, included not only spouses, but also persons registered under a civil partnership. It also includes permanent partners and ex-spouses, parts of a civil partnership that has been dissolved, as well to ex-permanent partners. So we see that the special legislation now covers more incident of domestic abuse. However, we must say that there is a controversy on whether the law refers to former or ex-partner and spouses, which may cause some problems and issues. Moreover, Istanbul Convention made some amendments to the restrictive measures that can be taken in relation to domestic abuse when deemed necessary for the protection of the physical and psychological well-being of the victim. We're going to see a little bit more of the restrictive measures later, but I would like to say that such measures include the removal of the accused from the family home, his relocation, or a restraining order banning him from approaching the residence or place of work of the victim, as well as the residence of close relatives, children's schools, or shelters. Now, with the Istanbul Convention, all those measures can be taken in a very early stage by the competent prosecutor. Moreover, after adopting the Istanbul Convention, we see that now Greece recognizes all forms of violence: physical, sexual, psychological, and economic. However, we must say that economic violence is often treated as a form of psychological violence and not as a form of violence per se. It also, however, brought significant changes in the penal code. For example, we have Article 59 referring on sentencing. We had a significant amendment there to address honor crimes. So the Article 79 stated that the customs and traditions followed by the perpetrator, as well as his religion, cannot reduce the punishment. However, this was removed in the new penal code in 2018, reducing the protection for victims of honor crimes. There was also a specific article, a provision on female genital mutilation. This is particularly important because even though Greece doesn't have a tradition on female genital mutilation, it's rather strange to us and never been committed by nationals. There are a lot of refugee women that are at risk of female genital mutilation, and we should address that. Article 323 on trafficking was also amended to include also forced marriages as a form of exploitation. The offense of stalking was also introduced in Article 333 on threat, which was again particularly important, and it's an offense that occurs a lot. Last but not least, Article 339 was abolished, which provisioned that marriage between the perpetrator and a minor under the age of 15 could terminate prosecution. So this was also abolished with the Istanbul Convention. In relation to prosecution, we must say that all acts provisioned in the Penal Code and in the special statute on domestic abuse are prosecuted ex officio. Serious forms of GBV violence are also prosecuted ex officio, like rape or female genital mutilation. This means that no formal complaint by the victim is required, is not a formal prerequisite for the state to intervene, to investigate, and proceed with the case. So the victim doesn't have the obligation to file a formal complaint within a period of 3 months. So the victim can notify the authorities whenever it feels ready. And the authorities should, at their own motion, when they are aware of such an incident, for example, by a third person and not the victim, should intervene and should proceed with investigation even without the consent and opposite to the will of the victim. However, there are several shortcomings here. We often say that police authorities are usually treating domestic abuse as a private matter, being reluctant to proceed ex officio without a formal complaint by the victim. This is particularly important for domestic abuse. For example, we had an incident yesterday of a femicide of a young woman who was killed by her husband because of jealousy, as the perpetrator said. And it's really important to see that in this incident, 10 days ago, in the mid of July, a neighbor has called the police saying that there is an incident, there is domestic abuse with the couple next to me, please come and ring my bell to let you into the building. The police arrived 25 minutes later. They didn't come out of the car and they just left doing nothing. And we see that few days after this, there was the femicide of the woman. So we see that the police officers are very reluctant. And of course, there is no risk assessment whatsoever for victims in order to protect them. They are also extremely reluctant to arrest the perpetrator following the procedure for caught in the act offenses, the flagrante delicto, which means that perpetrators are really very promptly brought to justice, which is of course another problem for victims. There are also incidents of discouraging the victims from filing a formal complaint. And there are also issues with working as referral actors, for example, to shelters or hospitals in the framework of a multi-sectoral approach established by the convention. So we see that there are several shortcomings in this respect. Just a moment. So particularly important, as you can imagine, in the framework of domestic abuse is taking protective measures for the victim. Because even where a victim comes forward and files a formal complaint, the problem is that the perpetrator is extremely dangerous and can cause further damage to the victim. So in Greece, we have two ways to gain protection. First, it is through civil proceedings, and second, through criminal proceedings. Civil proceedings are considered a little bit faster because we have the interim measures proceeding that goes on really fastly, in the framework of which, when there is an imminent danger, that some argue that it should be always the case for domestic abuse, you can get a preliminary order within a week from filing the petition. So it's really fast. The request can be not approaching the victim, the removal of the abuser from the family resident, his relocation, and the prohibition to approach the residence, workplace, relatives of the victim, the children, or children's schools. So it's a little bit broad. In the framework of criminal proceedings, we see that in the framework of the specific legislation, it's possible to impose specific restrictive measures to the accused if in the specific circumstances it is deemed necessary for the protection of the physical and mental health of the victim. The measures are pretty much the same as in civil proceedings, but we do say that in the framework of these proceedings, after the Istanbul Convention, the list is indicative. So even more measures can be taken deemed appropriate by competent authorities. Those measures can be ordered by competent penal court, investigating judge, the judicial board, or after the Istanbul Convention, very early by the public prosecutor, either ex officio or after a request from the victim. The victim, we must say, that can also request a measure to be revoked, replaced, or amended, but however, it's not binding for competent authorities that operate mostly ex officio in the law. In the practice, the victim has a saying in all that. Going to the field of the statistics, we see that Istanbul Convention, actually in Article 11, provisions the data collection and research, which is particularly important because there is no policy without statistics. We must know what happens in the field in order to adopt better policy and better protect victims. This data collection is monitored by Grevio, which is exactly the important fact because states have to keep the statistics. Here I have for you some statistics provided by competent General Secretariat on gender equality. This is statistics from the police. We see in this first line for 2019 that we had 4,151 female victims of domestic abuse, which is a particularly high number considering that there is a lot of attrition, a lot of victims are reluctant to report, a lot of victims are discouraged by the competent authorities. So you must understand that the numbers are higher than that, but it is again a relatively high number for the population of Greece. Here, I also have some statistics from judicial authorities now and not the police. You see in the first line, we have the number of restrictive measures imposed on offenders. We have in 2009, 46 measures taken against offenders. This is a relatively low number, but you have to keep in mind that civil proceedings are considered a better option for victims. So this is maybe why this is so low. And in the second line, we have the annual number of prosecution for domestic abuse. In 2009, we have 4,097. The number next to it is against women. And in the third row, we have the number of convictions. Here you see that the number is extremely low in relation to prosecutions, is 1 to 4. But we also have to keep in mind the great delays in the proceedings and the attrition in the domestic abuse cases. So yes, this is a number that we must consider because it is extremely low in relation to the field. But we also have to keep in mind that even though there are some statistics in Greece after the Istanbul Convention, and this is really important, this is the impact of the Istanbul Convention in statistics, there are not yet comparable, reliable, and coherent data following the obligations from the Istanbul Convention. Last but not least, I would like to make some review of the COVID-19 situation that we know that it caused a lot of problems in relation to domestic abuse. In Greece, there are no specific data on how it affected the field in the domestic abuse, but we have to say that from the field, from experience in the field, there was a rise in those incidents. And during the COVID-19, we also had the Me Too movement here in Greece that also gave more boost to this domestic abuse sensibility that was caused. We have, however, some data from the first annual report on violence against women published by the General Secretariat for Family Policy for the first lockdown period in 2020. So these are data for March and April of the 2020. According to those data, the calls to the helpline for women victims, this is a state helpline with psychologists and social workers provided by the states. So the calls to this helpline increased dramatically. There is a 51% increase between the calls received in 2019 and the ones received in 2020. And you must keep in mind that this helpline is not the only source for victims. So we had even more victims than that chose either to go to a private practitioner or an NGO or didn't do anything at the time and just waited after the lockdown to come forward and end the abuse. 92% of the calls in March and 27% in April concerned incidents of domestic abuse predominantly committed by the husband. We see here how the lockdown and this forced cohabitation between spouses that had issues caused more domestic abuse and more serious forms of domestic abuse that led women to call the helpline. 85% and 91% of the calls answered in March and April, respectively, were made from women using the helpline for the first time. So here we had either women that for the first time experienced some form of violence in an unbearable way, or there were new forms of violence. This is something that we saw in the field, that a lot of women that, for example, experienced psychological violence during the lockdown experienced also physical or sexual violence. So we see that the COVID-19 actually made things really worse for women. And we also see that there are a lot of femicides. For example, in Greece, this first 6 months, we had 7 femicides, which is a particularly high number because we actually don't count incidents where, for example, the victim was seriously injured and further died in the hospital, but we do count only incidents where the husband or partner killed the wife. So it is a predominant and persistent issue. Summing up a little bit the situation in Greece, we see that the Istanbul Convention brought significant changes. I believe that it was a significant boost for the recognizing GBV violence and having some statistics and giving this phenomenon a concrete framework. So it's particularly important, the Istanbul Convention. But however, there are more things that have to be done. For example, in relation to police authorities, the sensibilization should be greater. There is then a need for further education on how to approaching victims in order not to discourage them, have the rights actually respected, refer victims to shelters, to hospitals, and provide all the help when minors are involved, because this is something that doesn't happen in Greece. Even though minors, in case of domestic abuse from a husband to a wife, are victims because they are witnesses to this violence, there is no specific framework of protection. And we also see in the field that a lot of times police officers are discouraging the victims by saying that you should think about your children. What about your children, where they're going to go now? And so a lot of women are actually saying, okay, I'm not going to report because I don't want my children to go to the hospital or to public houses right now, because there is no concrete framework. So there are a lot of things to do. And of course, the risk assessment is particularly important because we have women that constantly are calling the police, and the police are saying, okay, you can file a complaint, but this complaint is going to be reviewed, for example, 6 months or 1 year from the prosecutor, which is a relatively long period of time to be in danger. And sometimes this lack of risk assessment leads to more femicides, to more serious forms of physical and sexual abuse for women. So this was my brief, I think, presentation. I would like to open the floor for more discussion and see more parallels also with your legal tradition. Thank you very much.
Ms. Chotouman, thank you very much for your notable presentation. Now we are moving on to the Q&A section. Just a quick reminder again for our dear participants, questions for the Q&A discussion can be placed into the chat box. Let me vocalize the question. I'm not a law student and therefore wanted to ask if you could explain ex officio and in officio in domestic violence again. Let's assume a woman wants to report DV and goes to the police. After her complaint, the prosecutor acts as ex officio, investigates the issue without her permission. Is that right? She might step back from her complaint because she's afraid. Then the prosecutor cannot investigate again, right?
So the difference between ex officio and having a formal complaint is actually that when you have some offenses, for example, threats between non-partners, etc., a formal complaint by the victim is a prerequisite in order to investigate the case. For victims of domestic abuse, we don't have that, so the prosecutor can investigate ex officio. Which means that the victim doesn't have the burden to file a formal complaint. However, in order to avoid this, what you say, is that right? Which is a question, because a lot of women sometimes want to go back to the perpetrator, or we see that there is some form of reconciliation. So there is a special procedure, it's called mediation, where the prosecutor, before initiating the prosecution, asks the victim if she wishes to have a mediation with the offender. In the framework of this procedure, the victims and perpetrator and the prosecutor are all together discussing the case, and the perpetrator swears in his honor that he will not do anything like that again. And sometimes there are also some measures for the perpetrator, for example, going to a program for psychological help and relatively, try to avoid relapsing again. So there are some ways to not being so strict, this ex officio prosecution, which is actually important in cases that the victim is so afraid that cannot come forward with a formal complaint. And you have to know that actually filing a formal complaint you have to have the aid of a lawyer. So it's also something that costs a lot. So it's really important to have this ex officio prosecution.
Thank you very much. Another question. Dr. Chioni, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Could you give us more examples for effective mechanisms that could be adopted by the national police in order to avoid incidents like the one yesterday?
Yes, this was a particularly sad incident. I think that risk assessment is particularly important. There is an ongoing discussion at policy level on how that could work. There are some states that have a pointing system. For example, how many times incidents occur, how bad the incident was, which they are particularly important. And of course, more education and more the police officers should be alert and be actually trained to know when something can escalate very quickly and quickly refer the woman to a shelter. So we need better education and maybe a pointing system for those incidents, and avoid the delays, because the delays are actually causing more trouble and more frustration. So risk assessment and better referral to shelters. This is, I think, the only way to deal with this incident. And of course, the delays, because we know when incidents happen and when the society and the perpetrator sees that like nothing happens for 1, 2, 3, or even 5 years, there is an ongoing, actually, they think that nothing happens with domestic abuse, so they can do it again. And the society gets the image that we cannot do anything to change it. And this becomes a very persistent issue. Thank you.
Thank you. There are other questions. Let me vocalize it. Mm-hmm. In case of DV, how does the perpetrator know about the DV if she is not telling because of neighbors?
I'm trying to understand. I think she means how the officials know, because the perpetrator knows because he did it actually. If she's not telling or she's too afraid to tell, there may be neighbors, of course, because I think that domestic abuse, especially in case of very serious physical abuse, is known to neighbors. Of course, there are also the hospitals where women are going severely battered, and they know that this is not something that actually happened from a fall in the stairs. And they also should be alert and should be placed under the burden to actually notify the social services, something that usually is not done from hospitals. So actually, we must keep in mind that here we're not establishing a framework to go against the will of the victim. This is not the goal. The goal is to actually come forward in the place of women that they are too afraid to come forward. This is a protective mechanism for women that are too afraid, that they need the space and they need someone else to say, I'm here with you, I'm going to notify the authorities and everything is gonna be fine. Because their first reaction after so many years of abuse is to say, no, just don't do anything, because they're too afraid that they may kill them, they may harm the children, or their relatives, and these are concrete threats. There are things that they have been told by the perpetrator for years, and we have to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Otuman. There are two new questions for you. First one, thanks for the great presentation. Regarding the importance of preventing authorities from discouraging women and ensuring that women can report the violence, what kind of mechanisms should exist?
I think we answered that question. Is the risk assessment and the shelters that are particularly important, and the strong connection with hospitals and referral and first respondents to domestic abuse, because it may be the health practitioners. So a more concrete framework and more concrete policy on that.
Thank you. The other question, do you have any data on refugee women who experience domestic violence? Are they able to get help from law enforcement? Both Turkey and Greece host many refugees, and I wonder if you have any measures that we can also adapt.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are not concrete data on that. I already told that there are issues with statistical data, even for nationals. However, I have some experience in the field. I'm working at an NGO, particularly having a program about refugee women. So I have to tell you that there is a persisting problem. Women from Afghanistan and Iran are usually victims of domestic abuse, unfortunately. We see also serious forms of abuse, both physical and sexual. So in case of refugee women, we see incidents of serious forms of domestic abuse. It is a persistent problem because it's something deeply cultural. It's something that they are taught that it's okay. So they need a lot of time to understand that this is not something okay. This is not something that they should tolerate. And they have a broad distrust for the system. So we're trying to be also mediators, except lawyers, in those cases. They are afraid of police officers, and they have their reasons to be, of course. They are able to get help from law enforcement, but however, only with a competent lawyer and an interpreter. I think that the greater problem here is the interpretation, because an Afghan woman or a woman from Iran, or even a woman from Turkey that doesn't speak English, cannot go to the police station because there are no interpreters. So if she doesn't have a friend that speaks Greek or English, it's impossible to get help right away. And this is a really big problem. So I think what we need are more interpreters. We in the NGO that I'm working, we have our own interpreters because the system doesn't provide a lot of interpreters. So I don't have concrete measures that there to help you. I think that the only thing that we can do is have more interpreters and build more trust with cultural mediators, with law enforcement and women.
Thank you, Ms. Otuman. A new question for you. I'd like to ask nowadays, how is the Greek culture on the equality based on the gender? Can you share your opinions? She says she's really sorry if she misses the answer of this question due to her internet connection.
Okay. Greek culture and equality, I think we are really, this is my personal opinion, of course, and I think that we are really good on papers. So we had a policy adopted, we had this new consent-based approach on rape. So without consent is rape. We have a lot of declarative things going on. But however, I think that deeper, in a deep level, especially not in the high towns like Athens or Thessaloniki, but in the countryside, it is a persistent issue. We see that a lot of women are having low-paid jobs. A lot of women are forced to quit their jobs to be full-time mothers by their husbands. There is a concept of alienation, and we see that it is a persisting problem. And I think that as a society, we're actually focused on adopting at the declarative level more policy, ignoring the fact that we have to make this policy that is just on papers an actual reality for women right now. So there is a lack of, for example, here in Greece, as in Turkey, I think, we don't have a sexual education in schools. We don't have a way of actually learning the children that gender equality is something that they should follow. They should respect women, what is and what is not acceptable in terms of sexual relationship. So this is a really important thing, to have the education, to have a quality education in schools in order to build new citizens that know their limits and know that women are actually equal to men. And there are also a lot of problems in the police. We also see in some indications of police authorities that women in the law enforcement are telling us that I want to make a difference, but there is discrimination in the force towards me as a woman law enforcer that want to do something more for women. So there is a cultural issue going on even in law enforcement and in other male-dominated professions. So I think we are somewhere in the middle, trying to go forward with this issue. The good thing here, I think, in relation to Turkey, and I'm going to close this question with that, is that our religion actually helps with that. There is some issues with gender equality even in our religion, but it's not used right now as a mean to impose more restrictions on women. And this is something that we see a lot with refugee women. For example, population from Africa are a little more empowered because they've learned in the religion as well that this is not something that they should tolerate as a rule. And we see women from Afghanistan and Iran, how this perversion of their religion from the husband, the perpetrators, and the male, their fathers, and all the society is actually closing them into a bubble where they cannot escape. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I can't see any other question. So if so, I think that's all the questions our participants have for you.
Thank you very, very much for your questions, for the opportunity to present the situation in Greece. And I think that it is particularly important because we have a lot in common. Culturally, we are pretty much alike, and we do also have some also issues with refugees and with women coming from these countries. And I think that our policy is and should be pretty much alike. Thank you again.
Chotouman, how are you?
How are you, Professor? Thank you very much for your kind invitation.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We must work together next time. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your support for our summer school. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Ms. Chotouman. Here we are at the end of today's sessions. Hope that our sessions were beneficial for everyone. Many thanks to all whom participated in our sessions today. My warmest regards to everyone. Thank you.